Hello, everyone. Welcome to Iran 1400 Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Dr. Mona Tajali's new book, Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table. Thank you all for joining us today. As many of you know, the goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage productive conversations about Iran by looking at the evolution of ideas and institutions within the country during the last century. Today's discussion will most certainly provide us with another valuable contribution towards that goal. Before we introduce our guest, our communications manager, Tabi Anvari, will share some remarks on behalf of the advisory board.
Dr. Tajali, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project, as was mentioned, its mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to really promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. We are honored to have you with us today to share your research and insights on the Iranian experience. Welcome.
Thank you, Tabi. Now to introduce our guest, Dr. Mona Tajali is an associate professor of international relations and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Agnes Scott College. Her research and teaching interests fall in the fields of comparative politics, Middle East studies, and women's studies. Coming from an interdisciplinary background, she teaches courses in women in politics, Middle East politics and society, human rights, and international relations. Her publications include a co-authored book with Homa Hoodfar titled Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women, as well as several articles that have appeared in journals such as the Middle East Journal, Anthropology of the Middle East, and Journal for Women, Politics, and Policy. Today's event will be 30 minutes of listening to Dr. Tajali discuss her book, and this will be followed by 30 minutes for a Q&A session. Viewers can then ask their questions by doing so by posting their questions in the Q&A section after the presentation, or y'all can email your questions to media@iran1400.org. Now we will have a quick teaser and then we'll hear Dr. Tajali discuss her book. Dr. Tajali, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, dear Tabi, for that invitation. Thank you, everyone, for your organizing efforts. I am really, really excited to be talking to everyone at the Iran 1400 Project. And Sydney, thank you for your role. I look forward to our conversation together. I am going to share a PowerPoint that I have made. I hope everyone can see it from the beginning. So yes, as I'm sure everyone knows, a book project is usually quite lengthy one, particularly comparative book projects. And so I will not be able to present everything as part of the book. I mean, this project, the first time I did field research for this project was back in 2009. This is prior to the eruption of the Green Movement in Iran, and as well as before the constitutional referendum in Turkey. And then the last time that I finished doing field research for this particular book was in 2019. So throughout that decade, there's been numerous political and social shifts that this project has seen, and I've tried to conceptualize and theorize about many of them. These shifts have been electoral, these shifts have been politically motivated, there has been shifts for women's rights movements, women's rights organizing has also seen very important shifts. So all of this to say that I will just be able to maybe touch on various aspects of the book, but I highly, highly recommend our audience to go ahead and check the book out from Edinburgh University Press's website. I worked very hard to secure funding, and kudos to my institution, Agnes Scott College, for recognizing the importance of an open access publication. And there were numerous reasons why an open access publication was important for me. Among them was, of course, the fact that I am aware that academic knowledge and exchange between scholars in the West and scholars in the Middle East is sometimes siloed. It's very difficult to be able to reach each other and have these important exchanges with one another. And also because of the fact that this book is really for women's rights activists, women's rights movements, and this is what who the book is dedicated to, and who really shared their experiences with me. One of the countries, Iran, is currently under sanctions, where many have trouble accessing scholarly publications. And that's why I also pushed for this book to be open access. This to say that I really want to encourage my colleagues to look more into open access publications. But I do want to talk a little bit about gender and politics in the region, with particular emphasis, of course, on Iran and Turkey. These are some of the images that we often see of gender and politics. And what we do know is that across the region, but including in Iran and Turkey, women do compose highly politicized and mobilized sections of their societies. We do know, for instance, that women have high rates of voter turnout. Often it's either at the same level as men or sometimes even suppressing men, unless they want to make a political move by boycotting elections. So we are aware of that. We also know that women are really active in campaigning, in getting involved in voter recruitment efforts. We know that women run NGOs. And of course, we also know that women are quite active and sometimes at the forefront of street protests and public protests, although it is quite risky for them to be doing this. So there's been a lot of, and we also know that women are really active at party level. So as members of political parties, for instance, the Justice and Development Party of Turkey prides itself, it has been priding itself for the past decade, that it is the largest women's political organization in the world, with having nearly 5 million registered female members out of a total of 10 million members. So all of this to say that we do know that women are interested to get in politics. So there's high rates of female political participation. But when it comes to their representation, this is where we truly see a gap. And we're not seeing many women at that high level decision-making roles. And there's been a number of conventional explanations of this from the literature, from scholarship. Some have blamed that it's the role of Islam or Muslim culture that's keeping women out of politics, that because Islam is inherently patriarchal and therefore women are hindered from accessing public sphere, therefore the political sphere. Another body has been calling out the oil production as being one of the factors. This is by Michael Ross, who says that oil production really discourages women's entrance into the public sphere, and therefore we can also assume that this is why political representation is also hindered by women. Other bodies of literature have been placing the blame onto women themselves, that women themselves are not necessarily interested in politics, they're passive, or they're subjects of male control. Related to that, also that women are seen mostly as foot soldiers, that political leaders are much more keen with having women do voter recruitment or do grassroots organizing. But when it comes to actually recruiting and nominating women at high level politics, this is where there's a major barrier, and it's usually gender discrimination. While a lot of these factors do contribute to women's political representation, what my research does is really tries to take us away and move us away from those monocausal explanations. It's not just Islam, it's not just women, it's usually multiple factors and actors that contribute to women's political underrepresentation in the region. Also, when it comes to women's political representation, but what I mean by that is mostly women's descriptive representation, which means women's numbers at high level politics, there is often a lot of focus on top-down politics. There's a lot of focus on which political leaders are more willing to recruit women. And then when they do, the credit often goes to those male political leaders. What my research does is try to rather look at the bottom-up approach and rather tries to emphasize women's organizing, because as we know, much of the advancements and improvements that we've had it really has to do with women working the ground for sometimes decades, maybe even a century before they see some movement. So this research is also really about women's political aspirations for political office. So in my argument, I take both the structure and agency into account. So I argue that women's political representation is impacted by diverse obstacles and opportunities that arise out of political, legal, institutional, and social structures of their context. And what really interests me is how are women maneuvering from within these structures in order to go ahead and put pressure onto male political elites and to elevate their political status. So a major emphasis on this research is on women activists who are no longer willing to be silent, who are no longer willing to be passive to this. And this is where I place women's organizing at the center of my analysis. What I found is in both countries, in both Iran and Turkey, there has been a demand to increase women's descriptive representation or to have a seat at the political decision-making table, at least since the mid-1990s. This is what I mean by public protest and public campaigning. And this is right after the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, which was the first time that the international community recognized the importance of women's political representation, but also recognized that it's not women, it's rather the governments that need to take more action in order to include and increase women's political representation. And one major tool that the international community recommended at the time was gender quotas. Gender quotas as affirmative action measures to be able to increase women's numbers. Both Iranian and Turkish women participated in Beijing, and they brought those demands back home with them. I also found that the demand to be included in high-level politics occurs from women regardless of those religious and ideological tendencies. So that meant that regardless of if women were considered conservative or religious or secular, I was able to see that they all deem that this is an important demand, that they need to be in high-level politics. In Turkey, that meant that I included the voices and experiences of pious women. Pious women could be divided into two additional groups. One would be those who identify as conservative religious women, likely those who are in support of the ruling Justice and Development Party. Then you have other pious women who are in opposition to the Justice and Development Party, and maybe they identify themselves as feminists, as religious feminists. Then, of course, also we have secular feminists that have been really important within the debates on gender and politics in the Turkish context. Again, you have extremist secularists, such as Kemalists, but then you have many others who are much more tolerant of public expressions of piety. And of course, ethnic Kurds, which anybody who studies gender and politics in Turkey needs to pay particular attention to ethnic Kurds. So I would be more than happy to discuss more and elaborate more on them during the question and answer session, because they have been, in a way, sort of trailblazers in gender and politics in the region. Very similarly in Iran, I also heard this demand coming from conservative women. These are the self-identified conservative women who are mostly aligned with the conservative faction in Iran, as well as from the reformist women and secular women. While the first two, conservative and reformist women, do not necessarily have an issue with the theocracy, it's really secular women who are more advocating a change to the system, to a separation of state and religion. And what I found as well is that the organizing that women have done around this demand has had surprising successes. But what I mean by that is that women have been able to reach high-level political office despite the numerous constraints that they face. Among them is the conservative gender ideology that often the ruling groups and leaders and parties hold, but also the inherently authoritarian system that much of these elections are taking place in between. Very quickly, I want to give you guys some examples of what I mean by these surprising, I mean unexpected successes. In Turkey, for instance, the rate of women's parliamentary presence increased notably with the coming to power of conservative religious party. Of course, one of them would be the currently ruling party, which is the Justice and Development Party, under the leadership of Erdogan. This is surprising for the case of Turkey because Turkey is the first country in the region to have granted women the right to vote, which was as early as 1934. But then for decades, when we mostly saw secular parties in power, women's political representation was quite low, it was around 1 to 2%. And then suddenly, in correlation with the AKP coming to power, gaining majority of the seats, of the parliamentary seats, we see this notable increase. To date, when you compare the list of candidates of the Justice and Development Party in comparison to the dominant secular opposition party, which is Republican People's Party, which is Ataturk's party, you do see that AKP tends to nominate more women. The exception, of course, to that is the pro-Kurdish HDP, which has a gender quota, and it outperforms all of them proportionally, but they do have less seats in the parliament. Another example with regards to Iran is in post-revolutionary Iran, we've had so far only one woman serve as a minister, and that was not delivered from a reformist president, despite their promises. So both Khatami as well as moderate Rouhani promised that they were going to have women as ministers, but rather it was delivered by the conservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, where he went ahead and he nominated 3 women as part of his cabinet in 2009, and a conservative-dominated parliament went ahead and approved the candidacy of one of those women, the woman in the middle, Marzieh Vahid Dastjardi, became the Minister of Health. So these 2 examples are unexpected. They are unexpected because these individuals and these parties and groups did not change their gender ideology. Their gender ideology did not suddenly become feminist and therefore more willing to include women. They maintained their conservative gender ideology that highlighted women's domestic duties, and yet we see these successes. So how do we explain this? So in my research, I use 2 central elements of political process theory, which are political opportunity structures and framing processes, to try to explain this. And what I argue is that certain political and discursive opportunity structures have enabled women's groups to demand women's access to politics in a way that garners the most public support and yields the most pressure onto the elites. And here I really want to emphasize that the role of the public and the role of the electorate is quite essential here, often because the electorate actually has its sympathy with the women. And that's where, given the fact that both Iran and Turkey are hybrid states, I will explain what I mean by hybrid states in just a bit. You have those Republican elements, and that in itself allows women to sort of gain a platform, to mobilize around something and actually gain the support of the public, which then forces the elites to be responsive to that. So this is where, similarly, we've seen political elites, having realized women's political might at the ballot box, are taking measures to strategically recruit women to formal politics. Again, some of these could be just in tokenistic levels, where conservative elites, in order to appeal to the electorate and sometimes even to the international community, are more willing to recruit women in order to sort of elevate their status or to show their distance from much more conservative factions of the society. So given suitable opportunities, both groups actually interact with one another in order to farther their interests, and sort of, we can call this sort of a strategic interaction that takes place. So in this research, I take an institutionalist analysis of gender and politics in Iran and Turkey. And very briefly, I want to talk about why I picked Iran and Turkey as 2 case studies for this comparative research. They were chosen because of the important commonalities and similarities, commonalities and differences that they hold with one another. Both of them, as I mentioned earlier, are considered hybrid states. Hybrid states are states that have Republican features, such as regular elections. So in both countries, we do see regular elections held, although Turkey has been disrupting them as of recently. But they do function under quite authoritarian features as well. Of course, when you want to compare Iran and Turkey, they are authoritarian to different degrees. I mean, Iran has various institutions that does render elections in a lot of ways meaningless, but nonetheless, you do have the public throughout its history, throughout the 40 plus years of the Islamic Republic being in power, the public still value elections to some extent, at least until recently. And this is where the women's organizing comes into the picture. The other difference between them is, of course, with the role of religion. Iran is a theocracy. And right after the 1979 revolution, we did see conservative interpretations on women's public roles actually enter into national law and actually enter, for instance, into the Constitution. Many might be aware, for instance, that the qualification to be a president does include Rijal, which is an ambiguous term used specifically by the regime in order to sort of keep it ambiguous whether women can even reach the office of the presidency or not. And then, of course, there's other limitations when it comes to women in judgeship and women having religious authority and so on and so forth. In Turkey, although currently we have a conservative religious party in power, as of yet, the law does not have any limitations on women's political representation. And so that's where, because of Turkey's secular legacy, we do not see those restrictions, at least legally, the same way Iranian women face those sort of challenges. Other similarities and differences is, of course, both countries benefit from an active women's rights movement, although in my research, I was able to find that at times it's easier for Iranian women's rights groups to join forces across the ideological spectrum in comparison to their Turkish counterparts because of that legacy of division between religious and secularism. And also, both countries have experienced periods of secularization and Islamization that did correlate with important openings and closures when it came to women's political roles and status. Nonetheless, women's groups in both countries have exploited their respective Republican, authoritarian, and in the case of Iran, even Islamic institutions to further their bargaining efforts for women's greater to political office. So this is what I'm able to document throughout the book, that a lot of the times you do see women being very conscious of where those opportunities might present themselves, including even if it's religious discourse, to be able to push for this. So some of the findings that I have found in terms of some of the political opportunity structures that women have faced, there are two important ones that really jump out. One of them is the role of electoral competition. That, again, although we're talking about highly authoritarian context, there is still some sense of competition. And thanks to the very hard work of women's rights movements and even secular women's organizing, in both countries, there is a public discussion right around elections of which groups, which parties are going to nominate more women or recruit, or where is women's status in a lot of this. And this wasn't the case, decades earlier, right? So we have been able to see this, and that in itself is a major sort of success of the women to be able to put this pressure onto the male elites. For instance, in Turkey, usually the dominant party leaders are sort of pitted against each other of who performs better. And the women's rights movement is very good to say, hey, I consider this party to be much better. And definitely that appeals that particular party's votes. And within the Iranian context, reformists and conservatives have been having some competition on this, although none of them have taken really bold moves, such as introducing gender quotas, but certainly the reformist faction has been much closer to this, and they definitely prided themselves when the last parliament, which is the 10th parliament, did break a record in terms of women's political representation and women's substantive representation, because many of the women within that particular parliament were quite outspoken on women's rights issues, which was a fresh air for many of the women's rights movement activists. And then the other finding when it comes to discursive opportunity structures and how did women frame and articulate their demands, I found that mostly women were articulating their demands either from using two particular discourses. One of them would be the international discourse, by which I refer to as international human rights discourse. And that meant that when it came to demanding women's greater access to politics, they would rely on, for instance, non-gender discriminatory language of the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW, which is a UN document. I heard this from Turkish women in particular. Turkish women were particularly successful with arguing for removal of the headscarf ban in that context, which eventually occurred in 2013. In fact, in 2019, some might remember that there was a democratically elected female parliamentarian, but she was prevented from being able to take her seat in the parliament because of her headscarf. And so women's rights activists utilized the international community's discourse to really pressure the ruling Justice and Development Party to finally address this demand, because at the time, AKP was really interested in international integration and the EU discourses. The woman in this picture is actually the younger sister of the woman who was kicked out of parliament at the time. That was Merve Kavakci, and this is Ravza Kavakci. But obviously, Iran not a signatory to CETA. Iran has been historically marginalized from the international community. So Iranian women's rights groups have had a much less chance to be able to really articulate their demands from that international discourse. And this is where I find that the regime discourse is what many women have been much more effective in sort of articulating their demands from within. By regime discourse, I'm referring to both the revolutionary discourse, particularly the discourse of Ayatollah Khomeini, and also to some extent of Khamenei, but also according to the religious discourse. So referring to the role of Zainab and Fatima and key Shia female figures in history to really say that women's marginalization from the from the public sphere, from the political sphere, is something that is inherently un-Islamic, because we have had these very powerful, effective female figures in Islam. And in fact, Iran is moving away from being a religious country when women are sidelined within the political sphere. So in conclusion, there's a number of contributions of this research. Among them is the fact that I try to shed light onto the complex factors and actors that impact women's political representation in the region. And certainly one of the contributions of this research is to move us away from the monocausal discussions that it's either Islam or it's patriarchy or it's women themselves, but rather really understand that it's actually a multiplicity of factors that lead to women's political underrepresentation. And at the same time, there's a lot of heterogeneity and dynamism of political parties and factions, including of religious political movements, that again, although the gender ideology of these parties might be quite conservative in that they advocate women's duties to be mostly as mothers and as wives, we do see that they're quite dynamic when it comes to recruiting women to political office, because it serves a particular political interest, and women are quite aware of that. So they are willing to utilize that for their own interest. Also, I'm highlighting women's multiple forms of agency, that women's activists can adopt strategies and framing processes that do not always resonate with their core identity claims. And as I said, this is where you did have conservative religious women rely on the discourse of the international human rights documents, which is a secular discourse, to go ahead and argue for their demands. But when they saw that it doesn't work, they could switch to a more religious discourse, right? So I think that sort of switching and recognizing that what's really significant, particularly when it comes to political representation and being forced to work with the political parties, what's really key is to find resonance with those individuals in power, and women have been able to do that. And for instance, I found that even secular women were very willing to use a much more religious discourse of opportunity structures, which is what I called, in the case of Iran, for instance, to go ahead and campaign and organize for more women in politics, despite the fact that they might be advocating for more of a separation between religion and state. So these are just some of the major things that I wanted to touch on in the book. There's a lot that I have left out, but I'll be more than happy to discuss it, and particularly to bring it up to today, right? I mean, where are we right now in terms of gender and politics in these two neighboring countries that often look to one another? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tajali, for that fascinating presentation. I want to remind the audience again how y'all can ask questions. You can comment in the Q&A section of the Zoom, or you can email your questions to media@iran1400.org. We're going to let Dr. Tajali take a quick breather while we relay some of our recent announcements of the project. So we have an upcoming Spotlighting an Author event with Pamela Karimi next month, September 16th, and she will be talking about her book, Alternative Iran, Contemporary Art and Critical Spatial Practice. We are also hosting a panel at the upcoming AIS conference, and so that's going to be titled Iran's New Century, the reckoning of Iran's national identity. Those who will be on the panel are Dr. Abbas Vali, Dr. Aram Hassami, Ehsan Kashfi, and Dr. Lior Sternfeld will be moderating the panel. We also have a podcast coming out on the 16th, and then the second part of that podcast will be coming out later in the month on the 23rd. We have a quick teaser to show y'all a little bit about what the podcast covers. Dr. Figueroa's article views the Iranian constitutional revolution through a broader perspective that includes several constitutional movements throughout East and West Asia that had shared experiences of anti-colonial nationalism and technological changes.
The Chinese constitutional revolution, it has its roots in kind of the same sort of processes that you find in Iran. And in general, both of these countries are more heavily influenced by their regional political configurations than a kind of cross-Asian identity. The history of the constitutional period, I think, is, still inherent, even in something like as recent as, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan that just happened.
That was a fun podcast to record, so please do keep an eye out for it. All right, now back to the Q&A session. So again, throw those questions in the chat and we can get to them. I'll start with a question that I had. Dr. Tajali, you talked a lot about the paradox of those pushing for women's rights using more conservative politicians or organizations to further their goals. And you said that those who were pushing for that knew that this was like a strategic alliance. So I'm curious, what did those on the other side of that alliance gain from that, if that makes sense? What were the more conservative groups gaining from using these women's rights organizers in this strategic alliance? And if you could just talk about that in general, like a little more detail on what that strategic alliance looks like. What type of organizations are involved in that?
Yes. No, very good question. And I guess the credit first goes to the fact that women's political representation even becomes an issue for these conservative political parties. And as I said, this is due to decades of women's rights organizing to really be able to push for the fact that, or really be able to justify that, hey, having women in political office is important. You simply cannot have a parliament, let's say, that is composed of 97% men. I mean, I heard this in Iran because Iran's political representation for women was around 3% until recently, and now it's at 5%. So it's still quite dismal. So if you have a parliament like that, some of these conservative religious women aligned with the Usul Garayan, with the conservative faction, they would tell me that, well, this parliament is un-Islamic, they wouldn't say it's undemocratic. They would say this is un-Islamic when you have 97% women because women are just not there and they're not representing their interests. And then they would use examples of, well, right now the parliament is trying to debate a bill on maternal leave. How can you have men, deciding on maternal leave? It needs to be women there. So certainly they had internalized the need to have more women in politics, but it wasn't according to secular human rights discourses. It was really much framed from within their own approaches. And through these discussions, they had been working on their male colleagues to really pressure them to be more inclusive of women. One example is Mariam Behrouzi. Mariam Behrouzi is, she passed away, unfortunately, in 2012, but she is considered sort of the poster Usulgara woman in Iran. She used to be one of the few female students of Ayatollah Khomeini himself. And when I had an interview with her, she was very clear. And she said that, yeah, I'm really upset with my male colleagues who are not being inclusive of women. And when I asked them to, hey, when it comes to parliamentary seats, please increase their numbers, for Tehran, let's say. So Tehran is a 30-member district. and you know, the most a party would ever nominate women for that Tehran district would be maybe 4 or 3, and she would say, no, let's have 10, you know, let's have, you know, 1/3, and they would say, no, 5 is enough. And eventually you did see this number increase because of the fact that of those strategic interactions, and because so you did have conservative women put pressure, and at some point when they saw that their male colleagues were ignoring their demands, they did threaten to leave. They did, at some point, women conservatives did put out their own women-only list, borrowing from the British, which the British Labour Party, for instance, had a woman-only list. So they did these actions, and then they saw that. So when you said what happens, you know, what do they gain out of this? Is when you don't have these powerful women being able to reach to their own male colleagues, then it creates a competition between conservatives and reformists in the case of Iran. So it did happen where both factions at some point were trying to be more willing of including women, but although it never took the very bold move that the women wanted, and it did lead to more electoral responsiveness, right? I mean, that's why we had promises, for instance, coming from Khatami and Rouhani and others to say women's rights are key. Even Ahmadinejad would say women's rights are key, right? So these are all, so it's used sort of as a campaigning tool to go ahead and sort of put themselves as, you know, I care for this section of the society because women were just really powerful to push for this. I hope that answers that to some extent.
Definitely. Thank you. That's very interesting. That definitely answers the question. Our next question is from someone in the audience who wants to know if there are any women judges in Iran or Turkey.
So in Iran, it is illegal, but right after the revolution, it was reversed. So you did have women judges right up to the point of the revolution, and then suddenly, I think it was a matter of weeks. That was one of the first moves of post-revolutionary Iran to go ahead and dismiss judges. And through a lot of negotiations in Iran, they are able to serve as assistant judges, but they're not allowed to give ruling, and it's only for family courts. So this is my latest. It might have changed recently. I doubt it changed recently, but the last time I looked into this, they can serve as assistant judges in family courts. Because again, women's rights movements were sort of pushing for the fact that it makes very little sense for only men to be at in such roles, but they cannot give the ruling. So, but women can sway the male judge in the ultimate decision. In Turkey, there is no limitation. Women and men can serve as judges. At some point, there was a limitation that headscarved women could not serve as judges, and I believe that restriction was recently lifted.
Interesting. Thank you. So the next question is, you mentioned, especially when Ahmadinejad was the only president who was able to have a woman's minister, or a woman as a minister. So with that in mind, and this is asking you to like gauge the hope levels of the people you were talking with, which I understand cannot like accurately be quantified, but I am curious, knowing that throughout a conservative or a reformist president, the one big win for women in the field of ministers was during a conservative presidency. Did that make it so people were less hopeful, saying that, say, Rouhani didn't pass this, and now essentially they don't have the essentially, yes, just are they less hopeful about having a woman minister now, and knowing that it doesn't really matter whether it's a reformist or a conservative, or are they still thinking that, say, a reformist is in power, this means it's more likely to have women's successes in Iran? If that makes sense, let me know if I need to.
No, that makes sense. And I think through your question, it's also very clear that it is a very complicated issue with the woman minister. The reason why it's complicated is because, number one, it was a demand of women from the reformist faction as well as women from the conservative faction. They both wanted women in the ministerial positions, and they even joined forces together in 2009 to demand this from all presidential candidates. And in fact, all presidential candidates at the time, there was 4 dominant ones, Mousavi, Karoubi, Ahmadinejad, and Rezai. They all expressed they would do it except for Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad was the only one that was not necessarily willing to nod to this particular demand. So a lot of the organizing was happening sort of prior to this moment when he went ahead and did it. And the organizing, as I said, was happening by both women. But then once Ahmadinejad was declared the winner, obviously was the eruption of the Green Movement. And that's where my argument of political opportunities comes in, is where suddenly Ahmadinejad was very keen to sort of highlight to the public that, hey, I'm not this conservative, illiberal president that you might think. And this is where the women of the conservative faction really thought that they have an opening with him and with others in the government, in the leadership, to go ahead and push for this. So in fact, Mariam Behrouzi did meet with the supreme leader, with Ahmadinejad, and with the conservative faction of the parliament to go ahead and get the appointment that they wanted. Then when it comes to the woman minister herself, there's also a debate. So when I talk to secular women, reformist women, even those who ideologically do not fall in line with Marzi Vahid Dastjirdi, who is her alliance is mostly with the conservative faction, they all agreed that it still broke a taboo. They all agreed that it was an important taboo. It was really good for us to see it happen. Yes, it was delivered by a president. We did not think he would do this, but through enough pressures and enough opportunities, he went ahead and did it. And then what makes the argument even more complicated is how she performed while she was in office. That although she comes from a very conservative background, she did end up being the one minister that ended up being dismissed by Ahmadinejad right at the end of her term, right? So this is where it's very easy to want to just categorize and homogenize people to say, well, you're conservative, your policies are this, and you're a reformist, your policies are, whereas in fact, there's a lot of shift, there's a lot of movement, and it was at some point that Marzi Vahid Dastjirdi believed that, hey, I may need to save myself, and let me come out of this, in this thing. And then again, that made her score some points with even secular and reformist women. The fact that you didn't have Rouhani post Ahmadinejad nominate any women ministers, he has commented on this publicly extensively, and he said, my hands were tied. What he's trying to refer to there is that there was a lot of pressure, there was a very little tolerance on his government to go ahead and sort of allow him to do this. And I'm one that I kind of believe him, because there was a lot of pressure onto his government. Raisi, post Rouhani did not, and I think he, there were other priorities there. And the women's movement, unfortunately, has just been so much more. I don't want to say divisive, but it's a lot weaker at the moment, with the coming to power of Raisi, and it's much more difficult for them to do the type of organizing they did in 2009 that eventually led to the appointment of Marzi Vahid Dastjirdi.
Fascinating. Thank you. On that note, what is, in the minds of organizers, what is the most logical next step? Take, for example, a woman president is very far down the line. What is this? What did you gather from your interviews is the ideal timeline? Are first you focus on parliament, then ministers, then president? Is there something that I'm missing there? What did you gather?
So what I gathered is that the demand is still there. And obviously, so in the last presidential election, which was the 2021 presidential election last year, that was by far the biggest boycott campaign that we had seen in Iran. And there was, particularly in major cities, right? Particularly in Tehran, right? Where you had the historically low voter turnout. And women played a major role in organizing that boycott. When I'm saying women, I'm particularly referring to secular women. So this is where they're like, we've lost our faith in the regime, and we think that we want to make our political move known in this particular way. And you did have some high-profile reformist women join that front. But then at the same time, for the 2021 election, you did have a number of high-profile reformist women actually make themselves candidates for the parliament. One of them was Zahra Shojai, who used to be working for the Khatami administration. She's this high-profile, learned woman, but she belongs to the reformist camp. And it was the first time that she ran with the campaign. I mean, she even like created a website. She even had a project, and she had bullet points of her plans and everything else. So this, when I look at these, and again, the interpretation of Council of Guardians of the word Rijal is still not clear. Many of the women feel that the interpretation will only get clear once they qualify a woman to run for the presidency, which hasn't happened until yet. But when I look at women like Shojai and the media interviews that they did, and basically just thinking of themselves as legitimate actors from within this charade of presidential elections, that tells me that the interest is there. That tells me that they're organizing for it, and they are thinking of the next steps, right? They are thinking that, hey, we never had a woman actually launch a proper campaign. Let's launch that proper campaign, right? Let's try to say that we're equal players to the men, although the system might not recognize us. So yes, I do think they are still working on this, and I think now the division is on where do we focus our efforts the most. And I think that's the challenging part at the moment, where some are willing to work with the current system, some are not willing to work with the system. Raisi has not been able to be responsive to the way that the women have wanted it to be responsive. And yeah, so it's somewhat of a complicated picture, but women are still interested in moving forward on this particular issue.
Very interesting. Thank you. In that regard, did you find in your interviews that someone would be more likely, or maybe not more likely, but someone might think twice about, say they normally vote reformist, but there's a conservative woman who's on the ballot for parliament. Did you find that some people there end up choosing the conservative woman, or did they generally stick with their political alignment?
That's a good question. I found from reform, and I do consider this as a factor that led to the weakening of the coalitions that we used to see of women across the ideological spectrum. For instance, there was a coalition that happened in 2009 prior to the Green Movement eruption and all of that, which was called the Islamic Women's Coalition. And that included women, high-profile women from the reformist camp, high-profile women from the conservative camp. They really came together. They would have regular meetings, and that was really effective. A lot of that has died out in recent decade, let's say. And part of it is because many are, between the reformists and conservatives, there seems to be sort of that competition that's sort of attacking one another. And so I did not see many willing to sort of, when they see that amazing. And usually the elections, at least at the major cities where it's multi-member district, you do see women just, either going with what the party recommended or not. That is completely different when you're talking about elections at the provincial level. And that's where independent women actually stand a much better chance. So when you have independent women running, they're like, I'm not reformist, I'm not conservative, I'm just here to, represent the interests of my district, of my constituency. You need that bridge, I will build you that bridge. And then that's where you see the women just, blow the votes out of the water. And it's no longer that party structure. So Iran is very tricky with its electoral system and the way it's divided, that we often forget that parties and factions is not that significant. when it comes to actual, people's needs. And this is where some are arguing that maybe the local council elections could replace that. And this is where women do historically do better at the local level than they do at the national level.
Fascinating. Thank you. A reminder to the audience, feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A section. Our next question has to do with and you covered this right at the beginning, that a lot of people think that this barrier for women in office is Islam. Do you think that this is a mostly Western belief, or are there those in the Middle East who also might see this, who maybe they're not Muslim, or maybe they are, and they still see that because the more devout folks might think this?
My research was mostly in response and in conversation to the Western scholarship that has been, which I call it essentialist and stereotypical in just, saying that it's Islam or Muslim culture without necessarily taking that ethnographic route, without necessarily talking to the women. So I think that's the gap my research tends to fill, is that, well, yes, Islam does have limitations. I mean, I would definitely not deny that. I mean, that the fact that, for instance, in Iran, there is the component of rijal, that is justified in religious terms, right? And it's a conservative interpretation of religion. And there's many women from within that religion, from within that faction, that are arguing for this, that are fighting for this. So that part gets lost. So whether Islam is a hindrance or not, when I talk to the conservative women, it was absolutely not a hindrance for them. Over and over again, I heard from women who consider themselves usulgara, or even consider themselves Hezbollah, and they would tell me that, had it not been for Ayatollah Khomeini, and had it not been for him to go ahead and publicly say that women come out into the streets in protest of the Pahlavi regime, women come out and vote in support of the Islamic Republic, even if your husbands and your fathers forbid you to. I mean, these were his words, because he was just so desperate to get that type of electoral support. Although years before that, he was one of the biggest advocates against female suffrage. Ayatollah Khomeini himself was. So to many of the women, this was a pretty revolutionary tone that they saw this charismatic leader take, and that opened the door for them to actually enter politics. And in fact, to this day, it still inspires many of them to want to be in politics. And that's why I would hear the things like, well, when you have a parliament that's 97% men, that's inherently un-Islamic. This is not how, this is not why we fought a revolution. This is not why we fought in the war, in the Iraq war. We wanted to see a truly Islamic society come in. But are these women feminists? Are these women believing in gender equality? They do not to the level that I would consider them to be feminists, because their intentions to be in politics is really to address a particular gendered lens that they have. If I want to clarify myself, a lot of their sort of contributions on gender and politics or women's rights policy is really maternal, like women within the family. Those are their priorities. And not necessarily, advancing women in other fields and so on. So although that's changing, right? It's very difficult to homogenize this group, because I think that's one of the things my research does, is to really say it's very difficult to categorize them. It's very difficult to say where they belong, but overwhelming majority of them, particularly those who do reach a level, who do come up, do not stand for complete gender equality. Maybe they would stand for another term that they use, which is gender justice or gender equity. Those are other ones. Whereas you definitely see the shift in more, see the change in more reformist women and secular women who do believe in women's complete equality, whether it's in education, in travel abroad, in citizenship, passing their citizenship to their children. These were all proposals that were put forward by the women in the previous parliament, including a debate on hijab, right? Or right now in Iran, we have this very, important discussion on mandatory veiling. It was the women MPs who said, hey, let's talk about this. Should women veil? Has the Islamic Republic succeeded in this or not?
Great, thank you. Our next question, why does the Nizam not allow women to attend sports inside stadiums?
Yes, that is a very contentious issue, and there's different justifications that are given for them. I feel that throughout the past few decades that women have been pushing for this, the justifications have been on religious grounds, that it's un-Islamic, women should not necessarily see the bodies of the male players. Then the other justification is, well, we want to protect women because this is a sphere where it could get violent, it could get offensive to women. So there's been different excuses, different ways to try to bar women from this. What's really critical to keep in mind is that women have continuously been pushing for this, and this has been a central demand, and it's been a central demand because sports stadiums is a part of the public sphere. So the understanding is if obviously, for some, it might seem like, well, why sports stadiums? Like it's but it is an issue, right? Because it's going towards that route of, do women have claim to the public sphere? Do they have access to the same opportunities or not? And that's where a lot of that contention comes in. And again, the response of the regime has been quite mixed. Ahmadinejad, for instance, was the one who took the bold move to say, no, women should be allowed. But then higher than him said, no, they cannot be allowed. So there's been openings and closures on this for many, many years, but women have been pushing for this ever since the launch of the women's movement, pretty much.
Thank you. The next question, another from the audience. Is Islamic feminism a distraction to the women's movement discourse, or is it a legitimate debate?
The Islamic feminist discourse is completely legitimate, particularly among the reformist faction, the reformist women that I talk to. They may not use the term Islamic feminism because of the negative connotations that some understand from the term feminism. Unfortunately, some understand it to be man-hating, some understand it to be pro-West and pro-imperialism and so on and so forth. But from our understanding of Islamic feminism, which are efforts and actions towards gender equality from within a religious framework, many do abide by that, many do agree with that. We do have a good number of what I call learned women, women who have been to religious seminaries and who have some sort of training. And again, this training is very limited because it's mostly men who can go to religious seminaries. It's mostly, and what they're taught is mostly by their male teachers. But you do have some women who are very interested in reading the Quran and religious texts and interpreting them on their own terms. And they've been very successful and very effective in pushing for these. On gender and politics, I know for a fact, much of the justifications that I heard, I would categorize as an Islamic feminist justification. Like, for instance, the figure of Zainab, which is a key historical figure for Shia Islam. They would say Zainab, stood up to injustice. And if she did it, I need to be able to do that as well, right? It's also my right to be able to do this. So this is where they're highlighting these instances from within religious perspective to go ahead and push forward a much more egalitarian agenda. And at the same time, highlighting that the discourse of the regime has just cherry-picked and just has picked the conservative factions, the conservative notions such as gender segregation, right? That's something that the regime has been pushing forward, but has ignored the figure of Zainab, right? So our job as usulgara, as zanane usulgara, or conservative women, is to really respond back and to say, hey, don't just emphasize gender segregation and hijab, also emphasize Zainab and Fatima and Bilqis in the Quran, which is a female queen in the Quran, and so on and so forth.
Interesting, thank you. We have time for just a few more questions. So to those in the audience, now is the last call. The next question is, how did you view social media as changing how people organize for the women's movement? And what was it like before social media? Like, especially me, I was wondering this because I'm in my mid-20s. And so when I think organizing, most of what I know is in the age of social media. How did that look like before people had the internet on their phones?
Yeah, so when we're talking about women's rights movements, in both countries. They've been highly active, and they're obviously, when you're running a movement, communication and disseminating your campaigns and your demands is absolutely essential. So prior to social media, we know that women's journals played a major role both in Iran and in Turkey. They had very high circulation. They became sort of this forums where important discussions around the women question was taking place on what should women's family rights be, what should, gender violence, what should be the discussions on that in both countries. And interestingly enough, they became such important political tools that it led to their forceful closures by the regime, right? So in Iran, for instance, we had Zanan magazine that faced multiple closures, forceful closures throughout years. And it's because it became that political venue where women were able to sort of discuss some essential things and really put it against the state to say, hey, these are issues that you need to go ahead and address. I feel that social media has sort of replaced those women's journals and those discussions, and it has facilitated much of that conversation, particularly in a context of Iran, which is, Turkey is also closed when it comes to media, particularly in recent years. Iran has been closed in terms of media for the past couple of decades, at least. So this is where it was sort of an important sort of venue for then women to go ahead and do their organizing there. And they have launched very successful campaigns, social media campaigns there, sometimes in collaboration and cooperation from women abroad, such as the hijab campaign, against mandatory hijab, or sometimes on just running it from within Iran. For instance, for the 2016 parliamentary elections, there was an online campaign that was launched by secular women that was called Change the Male-Dominated Face of Parliament. That campaign was fully online, and of course they held talks and meetings and all of that within Iran as well, but it had such an important online presence because Iranians are many of them are online, so they were able to get this information and sort of spread it among themselves as much as they could. And that's where the fear is, if there's going to be restrictions placed on media, that would inherently mean important restrictions on organizing, on campaigns, and so on and so forth in both countries.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question. And in line with the Iran 1400 project, which is to look at the evolution of ideas and institutions, this is another thing that you can't actually quantify. I'm just curious what you gathered from interviews. In terms of hopefulness for the future, how do you think now compares to, say, 20 years ago, especially with the changing parliaments and presidencies, political factions in mind, specific to Iran at least? Right now, it's very conservative dominated. Is this not as hopeful as it was 10 years ago? Or because more time has passed and the women's movement has had all this time to continue to gather steam, is that essentially canceling that out? Do you have any thoughts?
It is hard to quantify for sure. From my conversations, I guess the best way I can respond is, and right now I completely agree that it is a moment. Right now we are in a current political juncture in Iran where things just look really dire when it comes to human rights, women's rights, civil society, and so on and so forth. And yet we see instances of public protest, very regular public protest. We see instances of women pushing back. So my response is, no matter how hard it gets, we will not have passive bystanders. We will always have those that push forward and are trying to push forward. So this is like maybe my interpretation of the general public. When it comes to elite women, and I mean by women who did hold positions of power on behalf of the reformist camp, I think the issue's quite complicated. There are some of them who are still working from within reformist parties, reformist campaigns, who are still trying to preserve the nizam, the structures of the regime, in order to see that reformist agenda push forward. And they always face many limitations. Their parties get closed, or their activists get imprisoned and then they're released and then they can resume their activism. So I think right now is very difficult to be able to tell, but there is that sort of that division. There are large sections of the secular women's movement, for instance, that have just lost hope. That was clear based on the last presidential election, where they're not seeing any hope from within the reformist faction, and of course none from the conservative faction. But among the elite women, I think it's much more complicated, where some are still trying to work and trying to collaborate and see how this works. And this is where the role of the international community becomes really essential, is if those voices from within are going to be amplified, if the regime's atrocities are just going to be, just gloomed over. I think that's where a lot of trying to see what's at stake.
Great, thank you. On that note, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book. I'm very curious to look back at what you're doing look forward at what you're doing in 10 years, to be able to look back to this moment and see how things have since changed. Your work is incredibly important. And so thank you for coming and sharing about it and your book. If those in the audience enjoyed this, please do go check out Dr. Mona Tajali's book. Again, it is titled Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey: Demanding a Seat at the Table. And like she mentioned, it is open access, published on Edinburgh Press. Again, our next Spotlighting an Author is September 16th with Dr. Pamela Karimi. Her book is Alternative Iran: Contemporary Art and Critical Spatial Practice. You can find more about the project at Iran1400.org, and you can follow us on social media at Iran1400 Project. And if you found today's event interesting, please check out our website. We have a lot of relevant content about women's issues in the women's movement. Specifically, we have done work with the person that Dr. Tajali co-authored her book with. Homa Hoodfar joined us for a panel called Challenges and Achievements in the Field of Women's Rights. This was in Farsi, but you can hear an English version recap, essentially, on our first podcast. And also, we have a variety of articles on the website on the women's movement that, like I mentioned. Thank you again to the audience, and we will follow up with an email about how you can access the book, and make sure that y'all are all aware of where you can find it. Thank you, Dr. Tajali, again for joining us, and I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.